Hello, I'm the Pink Phantom, and this is my podcast. Join me as I delve into the world of games and gaming, and especially old school RPGs. Together, let's voyage into the astral realm and check out my phantom thoughts. A quick programming note for the podcast. Jason Connerly from the Nerds RPG Variety Cast called to let me know that my Day 3 and Day 4 audio for RPGaDay month, I had left the Day 2 stuff at the front of Day 3 and Day 4. I have corrected those podcasts, so if you haven't listened to those podcasts for some reason yet, they are corrected now. So, thank you, Jason. And now on with the show. And now let's get into some Jason calls. Or is it Jason's calls? Not with an apostrophe. Just, you'll see. Since as of this recording, it's RPGaDay month, I'm going to kick off this podcast by giving a list of podcasts that I enjoy listening to. Virtually all of them are RPG related in one way or another. Actually, I think all of them, not just virtually all of them, but all of them are RPG related in one way or another. Most, if not all, are doing RPGaDay month in some way, shape, or form. A lot of them aren't doing it daily. They're doing it weekly. They're doing it every few days. And I'm going to stop talking now, except to list these folks out. Nerds RPG Variety Cast, the Red Caps Podcast, the Whispering GM, Down in a Heap, Bandits Keep, Decahedron with a K, Minions and Musings, Red Dice Diaries, Confessions of a Wee Timorous Bushi, and I'm going to spell Timorous for you. It's TIM apostrophe ROUS, and for that matter, Bushi is BUSHI. Random Screed, Shadow of the GM, Keep Off the Borderlands, The Arcane Alienist, Spike Pit, Roleplay Rescue, Casting Shadows, The Dungeon Master's Handbook, Jules from NZ, that's NZ, and Hindsightless. All these folks are fantastic. They're worth listening to. I'm going to put links to all their podcasts in the show notes to this episode. And go check those folks out because if you're listening to this podcast, you'll like those.
Hey, Pink Phantom, Jason here. Congratulations on 50 episodes. Keep up the great work. Really enjoying the solo play. And I'm enjoying your RPGaDay. I'll call in at the end of the month to do a final kudos and thoughts on that campaign or on that story. But really enjoying it. So thank you for all that you're doing. Yeah, it is appreciated.
Thank you, Jason, for the kudos, and thank you for the call. You're always so kind in your calls and thought-provoking when you call in and contribute to a topic, and I really appreciate that. And for everybody out there, that's Jason from the Nerds RPG Variety Cast. I mentioned his podcast earlier. If you listen to pretty much any of those other podcasts that I listed, chances are you'll hear Jason's voice on them at some point because he does a podcast worth of shows every week, just calling into other shows. He's fantastic. He calls in to give kudos. He calls in to relate to topics. He calls in to throw out ideas. He's just really fantastic. He does a lot of great things for this little community that a lot of us have created here for ourselves. And others. We like others too. It's a community for everybody, but we're the only ones in it right now. Come join our community. We'd love it. Come in as a caller, come in as a podcaster. But he does great work. On his podcast, he talks about RPGs, of course, but he also talks about movies, TV shows, just a lot of different topics. That's why it's the Nerds RPG Variety Cast. He does interviews sometimes. He does has people co-hosting episodes with him about various movies and TV shows. It's just great stuff, and you're missing out by not listening to that. I know I mentioned it earlier, but since he called in, he gets another mention. So thank you, Jason.
Hey, Phantom, it's Hobbs. Hey, I've been listening to your show, and
take the next right onto Blue Mound Road.
I'm curious about a couple different things. Number one is the sheer amount of time that you're putting into the Dragon Slayer stuff, and obviously you're having fun
Continue
with
on
it.
Blue Mound Road for 3 miles.
But is that more fun than it would be to just playing a game with other people? And I understand scheduling sucks, but just the sheer amount of time that you do with the actual play, and then editing, and then talking about it, and all the added pieces. I mean, is it more fun for you to do it, or would it be more fun to actually run a game in that setting? That's question 1. Question 2, why this is about the combat between the nomads and the bandits. I can just not understand why the bandits would fight to the last man like that. You mentioned at the end that it's a Pyrrhic victory for the nomads, but they didn't really have a lot of choice. They were totally being attacked by these bandits. But why would you die over just fighting, trying to get some treasure off of some nomads? To me, that doesn't make a lot of sense. And I'm just curious what your thought process there was. And honestly, you don't have to play this question or anything. I don't want any negativity or anything like that. That's not what I'm trying to do. I'm really just trying to understand your thought process and why people would play solo games and put as much time into it as you and many others seem to do, as opposed to just playing a game with other dudes. Really looking forward to it, enjoying the show. So have a good one.
That is Jason Hobbs of the Random Screed podcast and the currently on hiatus Hobbs and Friends podcast. Check both of those out. First of all, thank you, Jason, for calling in. I appreciate the call. I didn't see anything negative in the call. I understand where you're coming from asking those kind of questions. And I also see, like you said, how maybe it could be perceived as negativity. I didn't take it that way. I understand what you're saying here. I'm going to answer your second question first because I think it's a little simpler. Why did the brigands fight to the end? It's kind of a dual answer. One is they didn't, in a way, because I ran it by morale. So basically, they did, but they didn't, which is I know is a terrible answer. They did because they were making morale checks. I was doing morale checks. I would kind of evaluate things after each round and say, okay, do we need morale checks here? And they passed a lot of morale checks. And then when they failed morale checks and were going to run, because in most cases they were going to run, there were just a few where they were going to surrender, and they got cut down because in the AD&D system, somebody turns and runs, everybody basically gets a free shot. And just the sheer, with the horses involved in melee after the first round of combat, horses get 3 attacks, and then you got nomads getting an attack. And so, especially with the 0 level brigands, they were getting just absolutely cut down. And the same thing happened to most of the leveled, especially the lower leveled characters. In terms of why did they not make morale checks in certain situations, they were doing pretty well at first. And I kind of, just the way the battlefield broke down, they kind of were fighting in groups, and the groups were fighting even or fighting better than even in a lot of cases. I did take a lot of time kind of thinking of what the archers would be doing, because they're invisible and they're in cover as well. So they've got like trees and stuff blocking shots. So to me, that would give them, kind of a sense of, well, they're not going to hit me even. And, with the added complication of, you can't really see your fellows fall if they're invisible. You might hear one that's near you fall, but you can't really see them fall. So, if you're take a particularly devastating barrage, unless you're counting the arrows going out, you're not really noticing. And the number of arrows coming in was decreasing as well. Plus, you can see the nomads falling off their horses as they're getting hit. And a similar thing was taking place in various parts of the battlefield. The big battle kind of, I guess, was in the middle part of the battlefield, and it was just kind of a wave waves of people coming in. There was an initial clash. The bandits did well, and then when they started getting, when a wave of nomads came in, then another wave of bandits came in, and it just went back and forth like that. So there were times where it looked bad for the nomads. There were times where it looked bad for the bandits. And when I rolled, the bandits passed. So that's the main reason. In terms of what was driving them, desperation. They've got no money and very little food. The leaders probably know this better than the hoi polloi, so to speak. But like I said, those were the guys, the 0 level guys were the guys that got cut down pretty quick. Most of them died on both sides early. But the sort of leadership and level guys, they knew a little better what the situation was in terms of if you're. Plus, the leader was, I guess, the sort of personality I ended up rolling up on him and using the NPC tables was insane, which was you had to get a very high result to kind of get that. He was maniacal and fanatical. And when I rolled his stats, that actually backed that up to me because his charisma was middling, but his strength was high. So this was a literal strongman. So I think, you can justify it from a campaign perspective. That didn't really play into the morale rolls and stuff. And when I did morale checks, other than, they were going to fight hard for a while. And because it went so well at first, right up through the second or third round or so, because the second round was when the lightning bolt went off. That was another point in favor of the archers staying, was they were front and center to see the effects of that lightning bolt when like 2 or 3 units of nomads were just wiped out. So I think, some of it was the die roll, some of it was the situations, and then the rest of it was just when they did finally turn tail to run, they just, they were giving up essentially free attacks with bonuses and they got wiped out. So that's the answer. I didn't expect it to go that way. I figured the nomads would probably get pretty wiped out because of the invisibility and the surprise, and the brigands really been able to strike first. And I didn't really count for what the horses were going to be doing, how that kind of was a force multiplier. And then I figured, like you did, if things turned bad, the bandits would fail morale checks and leave. And they didn't. That's just the dice. The dice kind of made that decision. I made some decisions as to when to roll the dice, but when I rolled the dice said, nope, they're standing fighting. So, and my headcanon is they were just a young group of guys following this, kind of obsessive leader that they feared more than maybe even death on the battlefield. Is that a right decision? I don't know. It's interesting. That's what I found about this whole thing. It's always interesting. As to your first question, why solo play? Why do it that way? First of all, I think in terms of time, you talk about the time it takes to do this. If I have given the impression with this podcast that I'm doing this tremendous amount of editing, that is far from the truth. Mostly it's just me speaking into a microphone. The only time I've done a tremendous amount of editing for this podcast was with the initial dragon fight before I knew it was going to be a campaign. I was just wanting to do the fight and see if I play it by the rules, can this happen? And I realized I'd screwed up like 2 different rules that would have affected the combat one way or the other. So I had to go back through and kind of chop it up, and I didn't have to take anything out. I just had to add some stuff in. And that's the most extensive editing I've ever done on any episode, and maybe more extensive than every other episode combined. Mostly, I'm just talking in this microphone, and if I get all blah, 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 the recording stops. I go back, I take that part out, and keep on going where I was going from. So, in terms of editing it and putting it together for the podcast, I'm not doing anything extra I wouldn't do if I weren't adding it to the podcast at all. As far as now, it is unusual, I guess, the way I'm presenting it, where I had these little stories or whatever, and I didn't think I was going to be doing that. I figured, both in terms of for the podcast and how I was, tracking the campaign, doing session notes, whatever, it would just be pretty straightforward. This happened, this happened, this happened, and I would end up presenting it more or less the way that Joe does on Hindsight Lists, or Carl does on the GMologist presents. The way they present theirs, the way they kind of present what happened without actually going occasionally blow by blow, but a lot of times they're just giving you a general idea and talking about what the party did, and talking about it kind of in a third person, instead of presenting it as the characters saying exactly this or doing exactly this. But that's just not the way my brain has decided to process this thing. So when I go to essentially write up notes, session notes or whatever, it's not even necessarily, especially if it doesn't have anything to do involving a battle where there's a lot of dice rolls or stuff. It just processes as a story. That's the way my brain processes it. It writes it out as a story, and all I'm doing for the podcast is just reading it out. And I think as far as why, beyond, you said beyond stuff like scheduling or whatever. I mean, scheduling is kind of a big part of it. I mean, I can, again, unless it involves rolling dice, I can just do it in my head. A lot of it is not, I'm not doing a lot of stuff, especially right now with some of the things that are going on. Other than sitting down and working out the logistics of this is travel time and this is what the weather is, and marking off rations or figuring out how they're eating, if they're hunting, fishing, what have you. And I do that in a batch. I sit down when I have a chance to do it, and I do that in a batch for, a week or 2 weeks or whatever, after I kind of figure this is what they're going to be doing. And then rolling up, are there going to be any random encounters? And then if there aren't any random encounters to literally play out in some kind of a fight, then, or charisma rolls or something like that, reaction rolls, I just play it out in my head mostly. And I'm still getting, a handle on who these characters are and what they're doing. So sometimes it's like, well, are they doing this? Are they doing that? And, maybe I scribble down some notes. Okay, Sir Gus is this person. Bernie is this kind of person. That kind of thing of what they're doing and who they are. So I'm kind of working it out. And I think what I'm really, the part of the campaign, or big chunk of the campaign I'm doing now, is probably not something I could do with people, because some of this stuff, knowing who these folks are and how they're going to react to things, is something you would need to know at the table, be it physical or virtual, before you kick off running a campaign, or at least prior to a session, if you kind of know where your party is headed for that session, what they're doing. So to me, it would be more time consuming from, world building and being prepared if I were doing this for a group. So that's a big part of it. And there's that freedom of, you can pause and look stuff up more, versus you need to know things already, or you're just going to have to make a ruling and live with it. And so, and I'm trying to do a lot of things by the book. I know I have invented some stuff because I like mechanics. And so when I see something that I don't see an exact mechanic for, or if it's, especially again in the solo, there's not a lot of solo mechanics in AD&D. So if you're doing something solo that would normally be worked out by the players, then you have to work something out for that, or pull something from another source. So I know I've been doing that, but I've been trying to, by and large, work within the rules of AD&D. And so there's, I've got PDFs up for several different books, so I can plop through them. And some of that you could do in play, and some of that you couldn't. And if you're making rulings, you either have to go back later and say, okay, this is the way it really is, or what we're doing going forward, or you have to make sure you're recording what that ruling is to make sure that you're consistent for the rest of the campaign. And from my perspective, that level of consistency, which you want to have if you're in a group, particularly playing with other people, is something that is going to, in terms of building out the world, whether you build it out, some of it ahead of time, or or some of it just randomly, but then you record it and then you have to go back and put it all together, or, making rulings in more old school style where you're making rulings as you go and you make sure that you're adjudicating those basically the same every time. That to me is a lot more work than what I'm doing, where I'm trying to go primarily for myself. I don't have to worry about, am I, pushing things one way or the other because I don't know exactly what I'm doing, or because it's just for me. And I look at, if you're building a campaign, you have a certain responsibility as a GM, as a referee, to ensure you're being kind of fair and even-handed when you're dealing with other players and other people, because that's how you build trust, that they can trust you, that if things are going poorly for them, it's not because you don't know what you're doing or you've got an agenda, but that's just the way the dice are going, or that's the decisions they've made. So I think that kind of, putting things together, I hear people talking about these massive open tables and the West Marches style of play, and where people have multiple characters and things are going on in all directions. I'm like, wow, even with assistant GMs or substitute GMs and players doing things like session notes and stuff, that's still going to be a lot of work putting that all together to have it all be in one world and feel like one world. So I don't think it's necessarily that much more work. Is that why I'm doing it? Because it's less work? No, I'm doing it because I'm still relatively new at this. I mean, I haven't played a role-playing game in 30 years, 35 years, maybe 35 years. So, it's been a long time, and it was not it wasn't this rule set I had. I think we were playing BX actually. So it's been a long time since I've played a role-playing game, because I transitioned to board games, mostly war games, and then on to computer games, and then slackening playing games because I enjoyed a lot more reading about games and how they're put together and things like that. And that was how I kind of eased back into the hobby. I started listening to more podcasts 10, 15 years ago. I was listening to computer game podcasts, war game podcasts, then more general board game podcasts. If you looked at my podcast list that I listened to on a regular basis 7, 8, 9, 10 years ago, none of this RPG stuff would have been on it. It's just something that I've flowed into in the last few years, until I guess I was probably listening. I don't think 7 or 8, 9 would have been. It may probably less than 5, because I'd only been listening to podcasts for maybe a couple of years before I started my own. So I mean, that's where I am, and I guess the final piece of it is I'm more of a solitary guy. I just always have been. That's just me. I don't know that I can put it any other way. So I don't know this lack of opportunity because I haven't looked for opportunity. There may be more opportunity. I'm in a more rural area, but I'm not in one of those really rural areas where the next person is further than the next town is for most folks. So, and of course, there's always the online option, right? Because you can, as long as the time works out, the place doesn't really matter online. But those are the main reasons. I don't think it's as hard, as time consuming as maybe as your question leads me to believe that you think it is. I'm easing my way back into, well, I don't know if I'm easing my way into it. This is what interested me, so this is how I got started getting back into the RPG scene, other than this podcast, and then just I'm a more solitary person. So those 3 reasons probably would have taken a lot less time. I apologize to everybody out there for my mouth being dry. If you're getting a lot of dry mouth, I've been trying to drink water during this whole thing. It's just one of those days. But anyway, those are my answers to your questions. A little rambly. I think the last one was very rambly, but those are the reasons I have. But thank you for calling in, Jason. Again, everybody, check out Jason's podcasts. I'll have links to those in the show notes. The thing I wanted to talk about this week that sort of caught my attention was a video by MCDM Productions. They produce role-playing content, and they are developing their own RPG, and they put out a video called Tactical Heroic Cinematic Fantasy Designing the Game. And it was a peek into sort of their design process that they've been doing, and that's a process that's ongoing. It's not a completed game at this point. It's really in the beginning of development. And just a idea into how they were doing things. And also, the part that caught my attention was the middle part where they discuss, where the host of the show was one person talking. His name is Matt Coville. And he was discussing what exactly they wanted in a game. And those 4 words in the title, Tactical Heroic Cinematic Fantasy, those were 4 keywords that they came up with to describe the type of game they're wanting and to help them define it as they're playing. So they can say, does this reach one of those keyword goals, or is there a better way to get there? And the reason it caught my attention was there's a lot of edition wars. There's a lot of new RPG, old school RPG wars that go on in the various parts of the internet, Reddit and Twitter. No, I'm not calling it the other thing, Elon. I'm not. Don't call me. And other social media where it's back and forth about this is best or that's best, or people look at an RPG and they judge it on what it's not. And I really liked the way he expressed it in the middle of this video, because he gave it a real clear definition through explaining those keywords, what they were going for. And I think this is something more RPGs could do. Yes, there's always the back of the book, inside of the cover blurb that people say this is what we're going for. But a lot of times that's very stylistic, because sometimes they're doing it, sometimes they're writing the game manual with a certain style, trying to bring in the style of the game, but they end up not explaining what exactly they were going for, because a lot of games get tied up in what is an RPG, and that's a big subject that covers a lot of different ways to play. So having that specific idea, that focus, that way to focus, I thought was very interesting. I thought it was something that lots of games could benefit from, especially ones that kind of define themselves from other games. You know, this is, or nebulous definitions like OSR and old school, because we've had discussions a little bit on this show, but on a lot of other shows that I listen to and call into from time to time about what is the OSR. It's something we talked about last October when we were doing OctoSR, or some people call it OSR October, where we were talking a little more about OSR play styles and trying to reclaim it from some of the rather toxic purists that exist within that community, that exist within all communities, but since we were talking about OSR within that community. But sometimes when you define yourself by starting from something else, you leave people out that never experienced that, or maybe experienced it in a different way. So now you're not on the same plane, which is the same argument we have when we argue about what the definition of OSR is. So without defining what RPGs are for everyone, without defining what the OSR is, or NSR, or any other style of play that has a name attached to it, what Matt did in this video was describe the type of play that they want to invoke with their game. And I thought that was it was done very well. Maybe the best I've ever seen it done for any kind of RPG. And I thought it was something that we could stand to do more of without the sniping and chirping at each other and criticizing one style of play over another. So I have included a link to the video, and I've actually included the link to the part where he starts talking about how they decided what they were going to play and how they decided to define the way they wanted to make their game play. There's parts at the beginning, there's parts at the end. It's all pretty good. It's a 25-minute long video. The middle part that I looked at that I'm considering for this what I'm discussion or whatever you call this talking I'm doing right now is 10 or 15 minutes out of that 25 minutes. So I thought it was real interesting. Give it a try. Like I said, the link I've included in the show notes takes you right to that point and goes from there. And if you have any thoughts on it, feel free to give me some feedback. I'd love to hear from you. And now, more from my solo AD&D RPG campaign, Tales of the Dragon Slayers. The random encounter table has turned up orcs again for our party. They seem to be running into a lot of hostile creatures out here. So the first thing we need to figure out is, could it be that this is the remnants of the last group that they fought? Is it a group from the same tribe that they came from that have come looking for their cohorts who haven't returned? Or perhaps they've come back with the remnants to seek out the party or to seek out the dragon or both? Or is this a new group of orcs? So we're going to go to our trusty D6. On a 1 to a 2, this will just be the remnants of that last group. On a 3, 4, or 5, it will be essentially that same tribe, perhaps with the remnants as well. We'll say on a 3, it'll have the remnants as well, and on 4 or 5, they've just come looking for them. And on a 6, it's a new group of orcs. And with a 6, it's a new group of orcs. So how many are there? We're going to roll according to the monster manual. It is 30 to 300. Oh my goodness, 30 to 300. Let's see how many we come up with here. I'm just going to roll a d10 and multiply by 30. And 2 times 30 is 60. So 60 orcs have arrived at the cave. In addition to rolling for random encounters, I've also been using the AD&D Dungeon Wilderness Survival Guide process for deciding what the weather is going to be. And there's a chance to get severe weather, and in this case, we got severe weather and we got a tornado. So this tornado, there's 3 potential things that this tornado could do. 1, it could wreck the wagons, one or both of the wagons that the party had to leave outside. 2, it could plow through the orcs and injure or kill some or all of those. And 3, it could hit the cave with a chance it would do some damage to the cave and potentially the party inside. So I've tried to figure out a few odds. So here's what I've come up with. We'll roll a d6 for each one of those things. For the wagons, on a 1 to a 4, the tornado misses the wagons completely. On 5, it damages one of the wagons. And on a 6, it damages both. And with a 1, the wagons are okay. So now we're going to roll for the orcs. On a 1 to 4, it'll miss all the orcs. On a 5, it'll hit about half the orcs. And on a 6, it'll just roll through all the orcs. And we'll just have to see what kind of damage that ends up doing to them. And it's a 6. So whatever damage we end up doing is going to happen to all of the orcs. So finally, the cave. Will it hit the cave? On a 6, I'm going to say the cave will be damaged enough that it could potentially cause injury to the party or their horses that they have inside, and potentially even collapse the whole thing. So here we go. And on a 4, the cave takes a hit, but it survives. If you'd like to hear the mechanics behind how I decide what happened to the orcs with the tornado. Stay tuned right after the story. It's coming up then. Do you think this rain will ever let up? Asked Bernie. Judging by the storms, it seems we're in the middle of something nasty, replied Gus, as he brushed down his steed. The other horses neighed and whinnied uncertainly as a peal of thunder underlined Gus's point. Maybe more than one nasty thing, called out Edgar. Creatures coming this way. A lot of them. I'm seeing pole arms, too. Gus ran to his side as others began gathering weapons and shields. Peering through the heavy rain was difficult in the gloom, but lightning lit the sky enough. More orcs, yelled Gus, heading right for us. As the party began assembling in the tunnel and cave entrance for battle, a loud bellow came from the sky, and a dark cloud of rolling winds descended to the ground right behind the orcs. The group looked on in a mixture of gratitude and horror as bodies and weapons were swept up to the sky and tossed around. Everyone back inside, yelled Bernie. It's heading this way. The cave shook and debris rained down as the horses cried out and the adventurers pressed against the sides, praying to whatever gods they worshipped. In a few moments it was over. They looked out through slackening rain on the aftermath. Gus bounded down the path out of the cave. He looked back. Come on, if any are still alive, we need to finish them before they can recover. The rest looked at one another and then followed. So let's see what happens with the orcs. In consulting with the Wilderness Survival Guide, if a character is somehow caught in the open path of a tornado, he faces death in two forms. First, he will take 40-20 points of damage from being battered by whirling debris that is carried along by the tornado near ground level. Second, he will be lifted 10 to 60 feet in the air, carried along for 100 to 600 yards, and then dropped from that height, suffering falling damage in addition to any damage caused by the debris. And to determine how many feet in the air, you roll d6 times 10. Starting with the d20, 10 points, 12 points, 20 points, and that's it for the orcs. There's no orcs that have enough hit points to survive that. So the orcs are wiped out by the tornado. And the dice are kind to the party yet again. The opening music of this podcast is Strength of the Titans, and the closing music is Late Night Radio, both by Kevin MacLeod of Incompetech.com, licensed under Creative Commons by Attribution 4.0 license. Thank you for listening to Phantom Thoughts. I would love to hear your feedback. You don't have to be part of the show. If you want to contact me and let me know, hey, these are for your eyes only. I just wanted to give you thoughts, ideas, response, and it's really for your eyes or ears only. That's absolutely fine. I'd love to hear from you either way. So just let me know when you contact me. Just, I don't want to be part of the show. There are lots of different ways you can contact me. You can send me an email at phantomthoughtspodcast@gmail.com. And that can be a regular email, or you can attach an audio file to it. You can use the message button on my podcast site on podcasters.spotify.com/pod/show/phantom thoughts. You can contact me via my Google Voice number, 864-209-1441. You can contact me via SpeakPipe at www.speakpipe.com/phantom thoughts. You can contact me on Discord, The Pink Phantom. All this contact information is listed in the show notes of every episode. And thank you for those who call in. Thank you for those who don't call in. I appreciate you listening and hope you'll listen again next time. Until then, I hope you have a great day.